The wind came down from the Bighorn Mountains with a mean spirit, a norther that scoured the Cheyenne Basin and left nothing but the hard truth of the land in its wake. It was a wind that knew a man's bones better than he did himself, and tonight it carried teeth of ice. Cole Whitaker felt it through his sheepskin coat as he nudged his weary horse. Bess, toward the single point of light that was his cabin. The cattle were settled, huddled in the small draw where the scrub pines broke the worst of the gale. That was all a man could do. The rest was up to them and whatever mercy God saw fit to leave in a Wyoming winter. He swung down from the saddle, his limbs stiff, and the scent of pine and freezing earth filled his lungs. The cabin was a dark shape against the driving snow, a fortress of solitude he had built with his own 2 hands. Inside was warmth, coffee, and silence. He craved the silence most of all. It was a predictable companion, one that asked for nothing. As his hand touched the cold wood of the door, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was faint at first, then sharper, more insistent. A rapping. Cole froze, his hand hovering over the latch. No one came out this far, not in a blow like this. A traveler would have holed up in dry water. A neighbor would have had the sense to stay home. He listened again. There it was, a frantic, desperate drumming on his door. His first thought was trouble. Trouble always found you when you were tired and the world was dark. He pulled the door inward, and the wind screamed into the room, guttering the flame in his tallow lamp. A figure stood on his threshold, more a pillar of snow than a person, small and hunched against the gale. Cole instinctively moved to block the entrance, his body a bulwark against the storm. He could make out a long coat, a worn valise clutched in a gloved hand, and a face obscured by a scarf in the swirling snow. "Lost your way?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that was nearly swallowed by the wind. The figure nodded, a shiver running through its small frame. A woman's voice, clear but trembling with cold, reached him. "I'm looking for the cabin of Mr. Thomas Reed, the landmark, a split pine. The snow has covered everything." Cole's jaw tightened. Tom Reed's place was a good 2 miles east. A fool's walk in this blizzard. "You're a long way off. Reed's spread is on the other side of the creek." He expected her to ask for directions, to turn and brave the storm again. He had his own chores, his own fatigue, but she did not move. She seemed rooted to the spot, the valise looking heavier by the second. In a lull in the wind, a sound drifted from the plains, high and lonesome and hungry. A wolf. Then another joined the call, a chorus that spoke of the unforgiving wild. Cole cursed under his breath. It was not a curse against the woman, but against the choice the night had just handed him. He could not, in good conscience, send anyone out into that, not even a stranger who brought trouble knocking. "Get inside," he said. The words clipped. "You can't go anywhere tonight." He stepped back, holding the door wide, and she stumbled past him over the threshold. The wind slammed the door shut behind her with a boom that shook the small cabin. The sudden quiet was heavy, thick with the smell of wet wool and the unspoken questions that hung between them. He watched as she unwound the scarf from her face. She was a black woman, younger than he had first guessed, perhaps 24 or so. Her face was fine-boned, her eyes large and dark and exhausted. She carried herself with a straight-backed dignity that seemed at odds with her predicament, a poise that hinted at a life far from the Wyoming frontier. She clutched a worn leather portfolio to her chest like a shield. She looked around the cabin, her gaze taking in the Spartan interior, the rough-hewn bed in the corner with its stack of wool blankets, the stone hearth where embers still glowed, the cast-iron stove, the well-worn saddle and bridle hanging from pegs on the wall. It was the home of a man who lived with necessities and nothing more. It was a life stripped down to the essentials of survival, and every object spoke of solitude. "I am grateful for your kindness." "Mr.," she began, her voice gaining a little strength in the warmth of the room. "Whitaker, Cole Whitaker." He took the wet coat she shrugged out of and hung it near the hearth. He did not offer his hand. It was not his way. "You can take that spot by the fire. I will make some coffee." She nodded, moving toward the hearth with a stiffness that spoke of deep cold. She sat on the small stool he kept there, holding her hands out to the weak warmth of the coals. Cole worked with an efficient economy of motion, adding wood to the fire, filling the coffee pot with water from the bucket and grounds from a tin. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the reviving fire and the endless shriek of the wind outside. He knew he should not ask. He knew it was better not to know. But the image of this woman, clearly educated, arriving in the middle of a blizzard looking for Tom Reed, did not add up. Reed was a simple man, a decent neighbor, but not the sort to be expecting a visitor like her. "You have business with Reed?" Cole asked, his back to her as he set the pot on the stove. "I am his intended," she said, the hesitation slight but noticeable. "My name is Naomi Carter. We corresponded by mail." Cole turned slowly. A mail-order bride. It made a certain kind of sense, and no sense at all. He had heard of such arrangements, but they were usually for lonely men with more land than prospects. Tom Reed had little of either. "He sent for you." "The arrangement was made through an agency," she explained, her gaze fixed on the fire. She opened the portfolio she still held and drew out a letter. "It is all here. My passage was paid. I was to be met in Drywater, but the stage was early and no one was there. The station master gave me directions." She held the letter out to him. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took it. The paper was stiff, official. He moved closer to the lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a man of letters. He could read a brand and sign his name, but long passages of formal script were a slow, laborious task. He squinted, piecing the words together. "Naomi Carter, formerly of St. Louis, Missouri, betrothed to Mr. Thomas Reed, homesteader, Cheyenne Basin, Wyoming Territory." It all seemed straightforward enough, a simple contract. But as his eyes scanned to the bottom of the page, a name jumped out at him, typed cleanly beneath a scrawled signature, sponsored and witnessed by Judge Silas Creedy. A cold knot formed in Cole's stomach. Judge Creedy was not a man who did anything out of simple charity. He was the banker, the justice of the peace, and the biggest landowner in the county. He had his fingers in everything. And if he had sponsored this marriage, he had a reason. Cole thought of Reed's land, that small patch of prairie that was mostly rock and sagebrush, save for one important feature, the fork of Willow Creek that cut across its northern edge, providing a steady source of water year-round. Creedy had been trying to buy that land for a year, and Reed had always refused. The air in the cabin grew thick. This woman was not just a lost traveler. She was a piece in a game he did not want to play. A message from a man he wanted nothing to do with. His instinct for self-preservation screamed at him he should give her a meal, and at first light, point her toward Reed's cabin and wash his hands of the entire affair. Naomi watched his face. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the way the muscles in his jaw bunched. He was no longer looking at her like a stranger, but like a problem. It was a look she knew well. "Is something wrong? Mr. Whitaker?" she asked, her voice quiet. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "Creedy," he said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. "He has an interest in your Mr. Reed's land." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. He saw in her eyes a familiar weariness, the shadow of a woman who had been promised one thing and was beginning to suspect she was about to receive another entirely. She had traveled 1,000 miles to escape a world of prejudice and uncertainty, only to find it waiting for her in a different form. The coffee began to perk, its bitter, earthy scent filling the small space. Cole poured 2 tin cups, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed. His calloused and rough, hers slender and cold. It was the first time they had touched, and a current of shared humanity passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the storm outside and the one brewing within the cabin's walls. She took a sip of the scalding coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the chilling dread that was settling over her. She looked from the rough-hewn walls of this stranger's home to the letter in her lap, the document that was supposed to be her salvation. All her hopes, all her careful planning, had led her here, to the wrong door, in the heart of a blizzard, with a man whose face had turned to stone at the mention of her benefactor's name. A wave of bitter irony washed over her. She let out a small, humorless breath that was almost a laugh. When the mail-order bride knocked on the wrong door, she murmured, the words spoken so softly they were nearly lost to the fire's crackle. True love answered in the cowboy's cabin. The line hung in the air, a piece of gallows humor aimed at her own fate. It was a joke against the absurdity of it all, but in the quiet intensity of the cabin, with the wind howling its lonely song outside, the words sounded less like an ending and more like the beginning of a story neither of them had asked for. Cole looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not just a woman in trouble, but a flash of the wit and steel that had carried her this far. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that the simple, silent life he had built for himself had just ended. The world was born new in the morning, scrubbed clean and silent under a blanket of white. The wind had wept itself to exhaustion, leaving behind a sky of pale, brittle blue. Cole was already outside when Naomi awoke, the rhythmic chunk of his axe splitting firewood the only sound in the vast stillness. She rose from the pallet of blankets he had laid for her by the hearth, every muscle aching with a cold that had settled deep in her bones. The cabin, which had seemed a cramped refuge last night, now felt like an island in a sea of snow. He came in as she was folding the blankets, his presence filling the small room. He moved without wasted motion, stamping the snow from his boots and adding the freshly split logs to the wood box. He did not look at her directly, but spoke to the stove as he rekindled the fire. "The sky is clear. It will hold," he said. "Once I see to the stock, I can take you into dry water. Find your Mr. Reed." The name hung between them, heavy with last night's discovery. Naomi simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. They ate a breakfast of fried bacon and day-old biscuits in a silence that was more charged than the storm had been. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and she was a woman who had learned that words were often more dangerous than silence. The ride to Drywater was cold, the air so sharp it hurt to breathe. Cole gave her his horse, Bess, a gentle mare who picked her way carefully through the drifts, while he walked ahead, breaking a trail. Naomi was not an expert rider, but she held herself tall in the saddle, her worn valise tied behind her. She watched Cole's broad back, the steady, ground-covering stride that spoke of endurance and a life lived on his own terms. The landscape was immense, a study in white and gray, the distant mountains like jagged teeth against the sky. It was a beautiful, terrible country that promised nothing and demanded everything. It made her feel small, a tiny speck of color and hope in a world of monochrome indifference. Drywater was not so much a town as a raw gash in the prairie. A single muddy street was flanked by a dozen or so buildings of unpainted timber, their false fronts leaning against the wind. A general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a livery, and the blacksmith's forge, from which a plume of dark smoke rose into the clean air. As they rode down the main street, activity seemed to slow. Men paused in their conversations, their eyes lingering on her. Women peered from behind curtains. Naomi felt the weight of their stares, a familiar pressure that was a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Cole seemed oblivious, but she noticed how he slowed his pace, walking closer to her stirrup, his quiet presence a silent, unyielding shield. They started at the general store. The air inside smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and damp wool. The proprietor, a man with a nervous twitch in his eye, polished the counter with a rag as Cole made his inquiry. "Looking for Tom Reed. You seen him?" The man's eyes flickered toward Naomi and then away. "Reed can't say I have. Not in a few days." He busied himself rearranging a display of canned peaches. Heard he might have moved on. Had some debts. You know. Debts to who Cole's voice was low, but it cut through the room's quiet hum. "The bank, I suppose. Most folks do." The man would not meet his eye. It was the same everywhere they went. At the livery, the hostler remembered Reed selling his last 2 horses a week ago, but did not know where he went. In the saloon, the bartender claimed Reed had settled his tab and said something about heading for the gold fields in the Dakotas. The stories were all different, but the theme was the same. Thomas Reed was gone, and beneath the surface of every conversation, another name was whispered like a prayer or a curse: Judge Creedy. Creedy's been backing a lot of these mail-order arrangements lately. A grizzled trapper muttered into his beer. Not realizing Cole was standing behind him, brings in a wife. Homestead gets proved up proper, and then somehow the deed ends up in the judge's bank. Funny how that works. Finally, they went to the office of the town sheriff. Sheriff Eben Hale was a tall, stoop-shouldered man whose face was a map of compromises. His badge was polished, but his eyes were tired. He listened to Cole's story, his gaze resting on Naomi with a sort of weary sympathy. "I heard Reed left town. Cole," he said, leaning back in his chair until it creaked in protest, "paid off his accounts and lit out. There is nothing official for me to look into. It does not feel right." "Eben," Cole insisted. "This woman came all the way from Missouri. Reed was expecting her." "People change their minds," the sheriff said, his eyes avoiding Cole's. He picked up a pen and began to study its nib with intense interest. "Look, Cole, you are a good man. You keep to yourself. You bother no one. I suggest you keep it that way. Some business in this town is best left to the men who run it. Do you understand me?" The warning was clear. The law in Drywater had its limits, and Judge Silas Creedy was on the other side of them. They left the sheriff's office and stepped back into the cold sunlight. The town felt different now, its rough edges honed to a threat. The whispers followed them, invisible barbs aimed at Naomi. Cole saw the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she refused to flinch. He stopped in front of the blacksmith's forge, the steady clang of the hammer on anvil a welcome. Honest sound. "Wait here," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it. He went inside, through the wide doorway. Naomi could see a man of Chinese descent, his bare arms corded with muscle, working a piece of glowing iron. This was Li Wei. He and Cole exchanged a few quiet words. Li Wei glanced out at her, his expression unreadable, before returning his attention to his work. On the walk back to the horses, they passed a woman with a kind, weathered face leaving the mercantile. It was Eleanor Brandt, a widow who ran her own ranch a few miles north of Cole's. She gave Cole a respectful nod and then smiled at Naomi, a genuine, unaffected warmth that was like a balm on raw nerves. "It is a cold welcome to Wyoming," she said to Naomi. "I hope you find some warmth here yet." The small gesture of decency stood out like a wildflower in a rock field. The ride back to the cabin was even quieter than the one into town. The truth of her situation had settled upon Naomi like a shroud. She was stranded, penniless, the subject of a fraudulent contract, in a territory where her skin color made her a target and the law offered no protection. She was utterly dependent on the quiet, solitary man walking before her. Back inside the cabin, the oppressive silence finally broke. "He is not here," she stated, the words flat and final. "He was never going to be here." "It seems that way," Cole agreed, ladling water into a basin to wash. "So what am I to do?" "Mr. Whitaker," her voice trembled, but she fought it back. "I have no money to return to Missouri. I have nowhere to go." He finished washing, drying his hands and face on a rough towel. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "The stage comes through again in 10 days. You can stay here until then. We will figure something out." Naomi's pride, The one thing she had left bristled at the thought of charity. I cannot accept. I will not be a burden. It is not a burden. It is a roof against the snow. I will earn my keep, she insisted, her chin lifting. I can cook. I can mend. I can clean. She looked around the Spartan cabin. And I can keep your books. Your ledger. I was a teacher. I am good with figures and records. A flicker of something discomfort. Shame passed through Cole's eyes. He gestured to a small, dusty crate in the corner. There is no ledger. She went to the crate and opened it. It was filled with receipts, bills of sale, and promissory notes, all stuffed in with no order. It was a jumble of his entire life's business dealings. But how do you know what you are owed or what you owe? He looked away, his gaze finding a spot on the far wall. I keep it in my head. I know what an animal is worth. I know who I owe. Understanding dawned on Naomi, slow and startling. This capable, self-sufficient man, who could read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks, who could manage a herd and build his own home, could not read the words on a page. The discovery was so intimate, so vulnerable. It made her ache for him. She saw the deep, guarded pride of a man who had made his way in the world using every skill he had, and had hidden the one he lacked. She chose her next words with the care of a surgeon. Then let me put them in order for you, as payment for my board. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. For the next few days, a quiet routine settled over the cabin. She cooked meals that were a vast improvement on his usual fare of bacon and beans. She mended his clothes and the supple leather of his gear with the neat, practiced stitches, and in the evenings, by the light of the lamp, she sorted through the crate of papers, creating a ledger for him on sheets of paper from her portfolio. He watched her sometimes, a strange expression on his face. He saw the quick, efficient way she worked, the intelligence in her eyes, and she, in turn, learned the rhythms of his life, the deep quiet he carried within him, the fundamental decency that had made him open his door in a blizzard. One evening, after she had finished tallying a column of figures, she looked up at him. Your name, she said softly. C-O-L-E. It is not a difficult word. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. I have gotten by without it. You have more than gotten by, she agreed gently. You have built a life, but knowledge is a tool. Mr. Whitaker, like your axe or your rifle, it can be a weapon, too. In a town like Drywater, a man who cannot read his own contracts is vulnerable. She held his gaze. Let me teach you. It would be a fair trade. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the sigh of the wind around the eaves. He was wrestling with a lifetime of pride. A trade, he finally said, his voice rough. What would I give you in return? You can teach me to survive here, she answered without hesitation. Teach me to ride properly, not just sit on a horse. Teach me to shoot that rifle on the wall. Teach me what you know, and I will teach you what I know. It was a pact, a partnership forged in the quiet of the cabin, an agreement between two people pushed together by circumstance. He looked at her, at the steady resolve in her dark eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, he felt something other than caution. It was a flicker of respect. All right, he said. The next day, as she was reviewing the marriage contract again, a small detail caught her eye. The seal of the court, pressed into the wax at the bottom, seemed imperfect. The lettering was slightly blurred, the eagle's wings not quite sharp. It was the kind of detail a teacher, accustomed to close examination of documents, would notice. Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice tight with a new kind of suspicion. When we were in town, the blacksmith, Lee Wei, you spoke with him. I know him, Cole said. He is an honest man. He works with metal, does he not, with stamps and seals? Cole looked at her, then at the document in her hand, and he understood. Get your coat, he said, his voice grim. We are going back to town. They showed the contract to Lee Wei in the firelit chaos of his forge. He took the paper, his hand surprisingly delicate for a man of his strength, and carried it to the light. He ran a thumb over the wax seal. His eyes narrowed in concentration. He took out a small magnifying glass and peered at it for a long, silent minute. Finally, he looked up, first at Cole, then at Naomi. "This was not made with the judge's seal," he said, his voice low and certain. "The edges are wrong. The depth is too shallow. This is a copy, a good one, but a fake." The ride back from Drywater was a silent pilgrimage into a known danger. Li Wei's words had taken the vague shape of their suspicions and forged it into something hard and real. A fake. The word echoed with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. A fraudulent document meant a fraudulent promise, a plan laid by a man who treated people like property and the law like a tool for theft. Cole rode ahead, his shoulders set like a wall against the wind. But Naomi could see the tension in the line of his back. The problem was no longer just hers. It had become his. Judge Creedy's response was not long in coming. It arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, suffocating pressure. The next time Cole went to the general store for flour and salt, his credit, which had been good for a decade, was suddenly gone. The proprietor, the man with the nervous twitch, could not meet his eyes. "It is orders from the bank." "Cole," he stammered, polishing a counter that was already gleaming. "Judge Creedy is tightening up all accounts." Nothing personal, but it was personal. It was a clear message, a shot fired across his bow. He was being isolated, cut off from the community he had quietly existed within for years. The news spread. The next few days, men who had always greeted him with a nod now found something interesting to look at on the ground as he passed. He was now the man who was harboring the black woman, the man who was asking the wrong questions. He was trouble. The threat became more tangible a day later. While checking the fences along Willow Creek, Cole saw them. 3 riders on the opposite bank, sitting their horses and watching his cabin. One of them was a man he recognized by his swagger and the low-slung holster on his hip, Rafe Cutter, Judge Creedy's hired gun and enforcer. They did not try to hide. They wanted to be seen. They were a constant, menacing presence, a reminder that Creedy's reach extended beyond the town limits, right to the edge of Cole's land. Naomi saw them too, from the cabin window. She watched the distant figures, and the feeling of being trapped intensified. She had fled one kind of cage only to find herself in another, larger one. Its bars made of snow and distance and the watchful eyes of hostile men. The pact she and Cole had made, the lessons in reading and shooting, took on a new urgency. His first lesson to her with the heavy Winchester rifle was simple. "Do not aim to kill," he'd said, his voice low and steady as he positioned her hands on the stock. "Aim to make a man think twice. A hole in his hat is a better argument than a hole in his chest." One afternoon, as Cole was watering his horse at the creek, a shot rang out. The bullet kicked up a spray of water not 10 feet from him. It was a warning, a deliberate act of intimidation. Cole did not flinch. He slowly straightened up, his eyes fixed on the distant riders. He calmly lifted his own rifle, took a moment to aim, and fired. A puff of dust flew from Rafe Cutter's hat, knocking it clean off his head. The message was sent, an answer in a language they both understood. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Cutter retrieved his hat, and the 3 men turned their horses and rode away. But they both knew it was only a temporary retreat. The weather turned unseasonably warm, a false spring that sent meltwater trickling down from the high country. The snow receded, revealing the pale, winter-starved grass beneath. But the warmth was deceptive, a prelude to a different kind of violence. The real danger came in the dead of night. It started as a low rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Cole sat bolt upright in his bed, his senses instantly on alert. The sound grew, a deep, grinding roar that was not thunder. It was the sound of water, angry and unbound. "Get dressed," he yelled to Naomi, already pulling on his boots. "Now, the creek is coming up." He threw open the cabin door, and the roar became a physical force. In the pale moonlight, he could see it. Willow Creek, normally a placid stream, had become a churning, muddy torrent, spilling over its banks and swallowing the pasture. It was a flash flood, born of the rapidly melting snow in the mountains, and it was moving with terrifying speed. "The calves!" he shouted over the din. A half-dozen of his new spring calves were trapped in the low-lying paddock near the barn, their frightened calls barely audible over the flood's fury. There was no time for discussion. Naomi was right behind him, her face pale but resolute in the moonlight. They waded into the icy, knee-deep water that was already swirling around the cabin. The current was strong, tugging at their legs, the ground beneath them a slick, uncertain mud. They fought their way to the paddock, the water rising with every step. Cole worked the gate while Naomi pushed through the panicked animals, herding them toward the higher ground behind the barn. The water was waist-deep now, a powerful, living thing that sought to pull them under. One small calf lost its footing and was swept away, its cry swallowed by the churning water. Naomi cried out, a sound of pure distress. There was no time to mourn. They had to save the others. They managed to get 4 of the remaining calves onto the rise, but the last one was pinned against the fence. Its leg caught in the wire. Cole worked frantically to free it, his hands numb from the cold water. Naomi held on to the terrified animal, trying to calm it, her own body straining against the relentless pull of the current. Suddenly, the section of fence she was leaning against gave way with a sickening groan. The force of the water tore her from her feet. She had a fleeting impression of the dark, swirling water closing over her head, the roar becoming a deafening, suffocating silence. Cole saw her go under. A raw, primal fear seized him, a terror he had not felt in years. He roared her name, a sound of pure anguish. He plunged after her, but the current was too fast. He saw her surface for a moment, gasping, her arms flailing, before she was pulled downstream into the main channel. Without a second thought, he turned and scrambled back toward the cabin, his movements driven by pure adrenaline. He grabbed the coil of rope he kept by the door, his mind racing. There was a large, ancient cypress tree on the bend of the creek. Its roots sunk deep into the bank. It was his only chance. He ran along the edge of the flood, the water clawing at the bank, his boots sinking into the mud. He could see her, a dark shape being tossed in the torrent. He looped one end of the rope around the thick trunk of the cypress, securing it with a knot he could tie in his sleep. He pulled the rest of the coil free and plunged back into the flood, the rope playing out behind him. The force of the water was immense, a battering ram that threatened to break his bones. He fought it, driven by the single, desperate image of her face. He saw her again, closer now, her strength failing. He lunged, his fingers closing around the rough wool of her coat. He got a firm grip and held on, his own body now at the mercy of the flood. The rope snapped taut, the strain immense. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought it would break, but it held. Slowly, painfully, he began to pull them in, hand over agonizing hand. The rope cutting into his raw palms, he hauled them toward the bank, his muscles screaming in protest. Finally, his feet found purchase on the muddy slope, and he dragged her from the water's grip. She lay on the ground, coughing and sputtering, her body trembling violently. He collapsed beside her, his lungs burning, his body spent. They were both alive. For a long time, they just lay there, the roar of the flood their only companion, their bodies covered in mud, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. He helped her to her feet, his arms securely around her waist, and they stumbled back to the cabin, leaving a muddy handprint on the doorframe as they pushed their way inside. The aftermath was a landscape of quiet devastation. The fire was nearly out, the cabin cold and damp. Cole rebuilt the fire, his movements slow and deliberate, while Naomi huddled in a blanket, her shivering finally subsiding. The shared trauma of the night had stripped away their layers of reserve, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. The distance between them had been washed away by the flood. In the middle of the night, she spoke, her voice raspy. "I was a teacher in St. Louis. I had a small school for colored children. An agent came, a man who promised positions for educated women out west. He said it was a respectable post in a new school in Denver. He took my savings for the placement fee. When I arrived, there was no school. There was only a saloon, and a room upstairs they expected me to work in." Cole stopped stirring the fire, his back to her. He did not turn around, but she knew he was listening. "I left. I had nothing. A woman from the church told me about the mail-order bride agencies. It seemed safer. A contract, a guarantee of a home. I thought it was a way to start over, to be seen as more than just a commodity. I seemed to have a talent for being deceived." The silence stretched, thick with her pain and his unspoken empathy. Then he spoke, his own voice low and gravelly, sharing a piece of himself he had never given to anyone else. "My father was a drinker," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "When he drank, his hands got mean. My mother, she tried to stand between us. One day, I was about 12. He came home worse than usual. I stepped in front of her. After he was done with me, I packed a handful of biscuits and I walked out. Never went back. I learned young that the only person you can rely on is yourself. Having someone else depend on you, it just gives you someone else to lose." They sat in the quiet, their separate pasts laid bare between them. Two solitary souls who had both learned the hard lessons of betrayal and disappointment. They were bound now, not by a fraudulent contract, but by a shared night of terror and a moment of raw, unvarnished honesty. The next morning, the world outside was a wreck of mud and debris, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. A fragile intimacy had taken root. After breakfast, Naomi took out a small, worn Bible from her valise, its pages softened by use. She opened it and placed it on the table in front of him. "This was my mother's," she said softly. She pointed to a word on the page. "This is a letter. It makes a C sound, like in coal." He sat down, his large frame awkward on the small stool. He watched as her slender finger traced the shapes of the letters, her voice a low, patient murmur as she taught him to spell his own name. He felt a profound and unfamiliar shame, but it was tempered by a deeper feeling, a quiet gratitude for this woman who was offering him a key to a world that had always been locked. Later that night, Sheriff Hale rode out from town. He did not dismount, but sat his horse in the moonlight, his face grim. He handed Cole a thin file of papers. "I cannot do anything official. Cole, my hands are tied, but I have been keeping my own records." He gestured to the file. "Those are the names of 4 other mail-order brides who came to Drywater in the last 2 years on contracts sponsored by Judge Creedy. All of their grooms were homesteaders on land with good water rights. All of them disappeared shortly after arriving. The homesteads all defaulted to the bank." He tipped his hat to Naomi, who stood in the cabin doorway. "You be careful," he said, his voice low. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the darkness, leaving them with the chilling proof that they were caught in a conspiracy far deadlier than they had imagined. The thin file of papers Sheriff Hale had left them felt heavier than a stack of gold bricks. It was a testament to quiet cruelties. A list of women who had come west seeking hope and had instead vanished into the territory's vast, indifferent silence. In the lamplight of the cabin, Naomi read the names aloud, her voice low and steady, giving breath to the ghosts. Cole listened, his face a mask of stone, but she could see the anger simmering in his eyes. The abstract threat of Judge Creedy had taken on the faces of forgotten victims. The next morning, Naomi made a decision. Passivity was a luxury she could not afford, a lesson life had taught her more than once. While Cole rode out to check on his herd, she saddled Bess and rode to Eleanor Brandt's ranch. The widow met her at the door, her expression wary but not unkind. Naomi laid out the situation plainly, without hysterics. presenting the fraudulent contract and the sheriff's list of names. He preys on the vulnerable. Naomi finished, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He uses the law to break it, and he counts on his victims being too poor, too isolated, or too afraid to speak. Eleanor listened, her gaze sharp and intelligent. What you are suggesting is dangerous. Naomi, Creedy owns this town, from the bank to the saloon. That is why we cannot fight him head on, Naomi countered. But women in a community have their own ways of communicating, of helping one another. We could hold a social at the church, a fair, perhaps, to collect flour and medicines for the families hit hardest by the winter. It would be an act of charity, something no one could object to. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face as she understood the true purpose. And if, during this charitable gathering, a few women happened to share their stories in confidence, who would be the wiser? They brought their idea to Pearl Sanchez, the town's midwife and healer, a woman whose practical wisdom and steady hands had brought half of Drywater's citizens into the world. Pearl, with her deep connections to the town's families, agreed immediately. Fear is a sickness, she said, her voice raspy. Sometimes the only cure is lancing the boil. While the women planned their quiet rebellion, Cole enlisted his own ally. He met Li Wei at the forge, the scent of coal smoke and hot metal a comforting familiarity. Cole explained his need for evidence, something tangible that tied Cutter and his men to the creek. They watch from the far bank, Cole said. Their boots leave a clear print in the mud near the old cottonwood. Li Wei nodded, his mind already working. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, the two men crossed the creek. They moved with the silence of ghosts, finding the tracks exactly where Cole had said, using a mixture of plaster and water Li Wei had prepared. They carefully made a perfect cast of a boot print, one with a distinctive star-shaped pattern on the heel. It was a piece of the truth, solid and undeniable, which they wrapped carefully and hid in the forge. The Women's Aid Fair was a surprising success. The church hall, usually a place of solemn prayer, buzzed with life. The air was filled with the scent of baked bread and cinnamon, and the tables overflowed with donations of quilts, canned goods, and homespun cloth. On the surface, it was a picture of frontier community, but in quiet corners, in the pantry while sorting sacks of flour, or on the porch under the guise of getting fresh air, the real work was done. Naomi, Eleanor, and Pearl moved through the crowd, their questions gentle, their ears open. They found two other women who had come to Drywater as mail-order brides under Creedy's sponsorship. One, a young German woman named Anya, had a husband who had died in a suspicious hunting accident just months after they were married, forcing her to sell her land to the bank for pennies on the dollar. The other, a widow named Mary, spoke of how her husband had been driven off his land by constant threats and financial pressure from the bank. Their stories, whispered in fear, were written down by Naomi, each woman signing her name at the bottom of the page with a trembling hand. It was not much, but it was a beginning, a collection of voices that, together, might be loud enough to be heard. That evening, the cabin felt charged with a new energy. Naomi laid the signed statements on the table next to the list from Sheriff Hale. We have proof now. Cole, we have witnesses. We could file a petition, a collective suit against him. Cole looked at the papers, his jaw tight. He picked up Rafe Cutter's hat, the one with the bullet hole through the crown, which now hung from a peg by the hearth. He ran his thumb over the felt. A piece of paper will not stop a man like Cutter. A lawsuit will just make Creedy angrier. He will not just come after us. He will crush anyone who signed these. Anya, Mary, their families. He will ruin them. So we do nothing. Naomi's voice rose with frustration. We let him win. We run. This is how men like him thrive. Cole, on the fear of good people. This is not St. Louis, he shot back, his voice a low growl. There is no court here that Creedy does not own. You are asking me to lead this whole town into a fight it cannot win. I will not be responsible for that. The argument was short and sharp, a clash of his hardened pragmatism against her resilient faith in justice. It was the first time they had truly fought, and the space it opened between them felt as cold and vast as the prairie outside. She saw his fear, not for himself, but for the people he would endanger, and he saw her terror, the deep, abiding fear of being once again silenced and erased by a corrupt system. They went to their separate beds that night in a silence heavier than any they had yet shared. Creedy's retaliation was swift and brutal. Word of the women's quiet questioning had reached him. Within the week, foreclosure notices appeared on the properties of several ranchers who had been friendly to Cole. The bank called in loans that were not yet due, citing obscure clauses in the fine print. Then the whispers began, a vile rumor, seeded in the saloon and spread through the town like a contagion, that Naomi was a seductress, a woman of loose morals who was using her wiles on the simple-minded Cole Whitaker to get control of his land and its precious water. The final blow came when they were publicly barred from the general store. The proprietor, his face pale with sweat, met them at the door. "I cannot serve you. Cole, the bank, Judge Creedy. He has called in my mortgage. I will lose everything." They were outcasts. The isolation Cole had once cultivated as a choice was now a prison. The community that had been wary was now openly hostile. That night, the wolves returned. Their howling sounded closer than ever before, a hungry chorus circling in the darkness. It was as if the wildness of the land was mirroring the savagery of the town. Cole took his rifle from the wall. Naomi took up the axe. They did not speak of their argument. It seemed small and insignificant now in the face of the closing circle of threats. They sat at the small cabin table, sharing a stew of beans and salted pork, taking turns watching the darkness through the window. The flickering lamplight cast their shadows large against the wall. In the quiet, he reached out and his hand covered hers on the table. It was not a gesture of romance, but of solidarity, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together, two lone figures against the night. "I am sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right. Running is not an answer." Before she could reply, a movement outside caught his eye. It was not a wolf. It was a man, staggering through the moonlight, his form thin and ragged. He stumbled and fell, then pushed himself up again, his movements slow and agonizing. Cole grabbed the rifle and was out the door in a flash, Naomi close behind him. "Stay back," he ordered her, his senses on high alert. The man collapsed a few yards from the cabin. Cole approached cautiously, his rifle ready. He turned the man over. The face was gaunt, covered in a dirty, matted beard, but the eyes were familiar. They were wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Cole," the man rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "It is me, Tom." It was Thomas Reed. He looked as though he had aged 20 years in as many days. He was rail thin, his clothes little more than rags, his hands raw and blistered. They helped him inside, giving him water and what little food they had. He drank greedily, his body shaking with exhaustion. Between labored breaths, his story tumbled out. The day Naomi was due to arrive, he had been met not by a stagecoach, but by Rafe Cutter and another of Creedy's men. They told him he had defaulted on a debt he did not know he had. They showed him papers with his forged signature. They gave him a choice: go to jail, or work off the debt at a silver mine in the mountains. "It was not a mine," Reed choked out, his eyes haunted. "It was a labor camp. Guards with guns. We were prisoners. I saw 2 men die from exhaustion. I escaped 2 nights ago. I have been walking ever since." He was a living ghost, a testament to the depths of Creedy's cruelty. He was the proof they needed, a witness who could not be denied, but he had brought something more valuable than his testimony. From inside his tattered shirt, he pulled a small, grimy ledger book, wrapped in oilcloth. "The agent at the mine," Reed whispered, his voice gaining a thread of strength. He was a drunk and a talker. He bragged about the judge's cleverness. He kept records of everything, every man sold, every bride's fee paid. Naomi took the book, her hands trembling as she opened it. The pages were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting, detailing names, dates, and sums of money. And there, besides several entries, were notations in a different hand. A neat, precise script that authorized the payments. At the bottom of one page, next to a tally of profits from the fraudulent bride arrangements, was a signature that made her blood run cold. It was not Judge Creedy's, it was the clear, unmistakable signature of Samuel Blackwood, the president of the Drywater Bank. They had not just found a witness, they had found the money trail, and the man who held the key to Creedy's entire corrupt enterprise. The arrival of Thomas Reed and the grimy ledger he carried transformed the cabin from a simple refuge into the heart of a conspiracy. Reed, weak and haunted, spent most of his days sleeping, his body slowly recovering from the ordeal at the labor camp. His presence was a constant, grim reminder of the stakes. The ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a sleeping serpent, a source of both hope and profound danger. In the evenings, the three of them would sit by the fire, Naomi reading the entries aloud, her teacher's voice giving a chilling clarity to the cold calculus of Judge Creedy's greed. Despite the tension that now saturated the air, the pact between Cole and Naomi held firm. Their lessons continued, a quiet ritual of defiance in the face of the encroaching darkness. He taught her how to reload the Winchester with a smooth, practiced motion, how to lead a moving target, how to read the subtle signs of a nervous horse. And she, in turn, continued to guide his hand across the rough slate she used as a practice board, shaping the letters that had for so long been meaningless squiggles to him. He was a slow, methodical student, his big, calloused hands, so adept at handling rope and iron, struggled with the delicacy of the chalk, but he was persistent. His brow furrowed in a concentration she found both endearing and deeply moving. One afternoon, after he had finally mastered writing his own name and hers without hesitation, she set him a new task. She dipped a quill into the small pot of ink she had brought with her and placed it in his hand. On a precious sheet of clean paper, she had written a sentence. "Now you," she said, her voice soft, "copy it, one letter at a time." He looked at the words, his lips moving silently as he sounded them out. A slow, laborious process. H-O-M-E. He worked for nearly an hour, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. The scratching of the quill was the only sound in the room. His letters were shaky, the ink blotched in places, but he did not give up. When he was finished, he pushed the paper across the table to her, a sheen of sweat on his brow. Naomi looked down at the wavering script. "Home is where we choose each other." A lump formed in her throat. He had not just copied the shapes. He had inscribed the sentiment, the central truth of what they had become to one another. It was the first full sentence he had ever written, a declaration of a home built not of logs and mud, but of shared danger and mutual respect. "It is good, Cole," she whispered, her finger tracing the uneven letters. "It is very good." He looked away, a flush rising from under his collar, but she saw the flicker of pride in his eyes before he could hide it. A few days later, the sky turned a sickly yellow. A hot, dry wind began to blow from the south, carrying with it the dust of the high plains. The air grew thick and hazy, the sun a dim, copper coin in the sky. It was a dust storm, another of the land's casual cruelties. By late afternoon, the world outside the cabin was a swirling vortex of grit and gloom. They had brought the animals into the barn, their eyes and nostrils raw from the stinging dust. The cabin was sealed as best it could be, but a fine layer of silt settled on every surface, a gritty film on their teeth. The ceaseless, mournful howl of the wind was a nerve-shredding assault. Unable to stay inside any longer, Cole went to sit on the covered porch, seeking a sliver of peace in the maelstrom. Naomi followed him, wrapping a shawl around her head. They sat on the top step, their shoulders nearly touching. Watching the world dissolve into a brown fog, the raw power of the storm was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. "I have been thinking," Cole said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the wind, "about that contract of yours. And Reed's ledger." He paused, choosing his words with the same care he used to build a fence. "When this is over, if we get through this, maybe we could have a different kind of contract, one we write ourselves." Naomi turned to look at him. His face was streaked with dust, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. He was not a man of pretty words or grand gestures. This was his way of speaking from the heart, a plain, unvarnished offer of a future, a partnership of choice, not of circumstance. It was the most profound proposal she had ever received. She did not answer with words. The wind would have stolen them anyway. Instead, she leaned into him, and his arm came around her, pulling her close. They sat there for a long time, two small figures huddled together on a porch against a storm that threatened to tear the world apart. It was not a passionate embrace, but something deeper. It was a promise of shelter, a shared moment of warmth and steadfastness in a cold and hostile land. The fire came that night. The dust storm had blown itself out, leaving a sky scrubbed clean and littered with a billion cold stars. They were asleep, exhausted from the day's tension, when a frantic whinnying from the barn jolted them awake. Cole was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. He threw open the door and saw it. The hay barn, the smaller structure where he stored the winter feed, was a raging inferno, a pillar of orange flame clawing at the black sky. The wind, which had died down, was now fanning the flames, sending a shower of sparks toward the main barn where the horses and calves were trapped. "Naomi, get water buckets," he yelled, grabbing his axe as he ran. "Reed, stay inside." The heat was a physical blow, a scorching wave that seared his lungs. The roar of the fire was a living, hungry beast. He worked with a desperate fury, chopping at the wooden corral that connected the two barns, creating a fire break. Naomi was right behind him, her face a pale oval in the demonic light, sloshing buckets of water onto the roof and walls of the main barn, her efforts seeming pitifully small against the raging fire. Suddenly, figures emerged from the darkness. It was Li Wei, his face grim, carrying two heavy buckets. Behind him was Eleanor Brandt, her face set in a determined mask, riding on a wagon with her two ranch hands. News of the fire had traveled on the wind, a beacon of trouble visible for miles. The horses, Eleanor shouted over the roar. "We need to get them out." There was no time to open the main gate. The fire was too close. Cole used his axe to smash the wooden wall at the back of the barn. One by one, they formed a human chain, leading the terrified, rearing animals out of the smoke-filled structure and into the open pasture. A spark landed on Naomi's sleeve, and Cole beat it out with his bare hand. His movements rough but protective. They worked side by side, their faces black with soot, their eyes streaming from the smoke, their lungs aching. They moved as a team, their earlier argument forgotten, their shared purpose the only thing that mattered. They saved the animals, but the hay barn was a total loss, collapsing into a heap of glowing embers and black, skeletal timbers. They stood for a moment, the small group of neighbors, watching the last of the flames die down, their bodies numb with exhaustion. There were no words of thanks. None were needed. There was only a shared nod of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of a debt owed and a friendship proven. The next morning, the rising sun revealed the full extent of the devastation. A black, stinking scar marred the landscape. The air smelled of ash and defeat. As Cole was sifting through the debris, looking for anything salvageable, his foot hit something solid. It was a piece of charred timber, and stuck into it, gleaming in the morning light, was a large Bowie knife. Pinned beneath the blade was a folded piece of paper. He pulled the knife free. The note was short, the word scrawled in a crude, threatening hand. Leave or burn. It was not signed. It did not need to be. It was the calling card of Rafe Cutter. He showed it to Naomi. She read the words, and a cold dread settled in her heart, heavier than the ashes at their feet. The conflict was no longer about land or water rights. It was a direct threat to their lives. "I should have sent you away that first night," Cole said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. He stared at the ruined barn, at the black soot that stained the ground. "I brought this on you, all of it." Naomi took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was raw, blistered from the fire. "You brought me in from the storm." "Cole," she said, her voice firm, compelling him to look at her. "The storm just changed its shape. We are in this together. We chose this." She used the word he had so painstakingly learned to write, and it was an anchor in the swirling chaos. He squeezed her hand, a silent admission that she was right. Later that day, Eleanor Brant rode over, her face grave. She brought news from town that was even more chilling than the note. "It is Sheriff Hale," she said, her voice low. "Judge Creedy convened an emergency council meeting this morning. They have suspended him, effective immediately." "On what grounds?" Cole asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "Dereliction of duty," Eleanor said, her lip curling with contempt. "They are claiming he failed to investigate the fire at your barn properly. They have appointed one of Creedy's lackeys, a man named Deputy Miller, as acting sheriff. Cole, you have no law to turn to now. You are completely on your own." The final door had closed. They were isolated, marked for destruction, and the one man who might have stood for the law had been cast aside. The path ahead had narrowed to a single, perilous track. They could run, as Cutter's note demanded, or they could stand and fight, with no one but themselves and a handful of loyal friends to count on. The suspension of Sheriff Hale fell upon the small community of allies like a winter shroud. It was a declaration of war by Judge Silas Creedy, a clear sign that the law was now nothing more than his personal cudgel. For a day, a heavy silence settled over the basin, the silence of fear. But in the face of absolute power, sometimes the only thing left to do is to stand. The spark of defiance came not from a man with a gun, but from two women in a ranch kitchen. Eleanor Brant and Pearl Sanchez sent out the call. They rode to the small, scattered homesteads. Their message passed in whispers over fences and in hushed tones in church pews. They gathered in Eleanor's parlor that night, a small, determined group. There was the town pastor, a man whose faith had been sorely tested by Creedy's corruption. There was Lee Way, his powerful hands resting quietly on his knees. There were the women Naomi had spoken to at the fair, Anya and Mary, their faces pale but their eyes resolved. And there was Naomi herself, no longer a stranger but the catalyst, the unwilling center of the storm. "We cannot fight him with his own rules," Eleanor said, her voice a low, steady flame in the quiet room. "So we will make our own." And so the Cheyenne Basin Citizens Council was born. Their first decision was to pool their meager resources. They were farmers and ranchers, not fighters, but they understood that Creedy's power was built on a perversion of the law. To fight him, they needed the law on their side, a true law, not the one for sale in dry water. They sent a rider to Laramie, the territorial capital, with a pouch of coins and a letter of petition. A week later, Edward Tompkins arrived on the morning stage. He was younger than they had expected, a man not yet 30, with a sharp, intelligent face and a lawyer's bag that seemed too heavy for his slender frame. He was an idealist, a man who still believed the law was a shield for the innocent, not a weapon for the powerful. He listened to their story in the back room of Lee Way's forge, the only place they felt safe to talk. He reviewed the forged contract, the list of names, the women's signed statements, and the grimy ledger from the mine. He looked up from the papers, his eyes alight with a crusader's fire. "Mr. Blackwood is the key," he said. "The banker. Creedy is insulated, but Blackwood signed these papers. If we can make him testify, the entire edifice will collapse. Tompkins petitioned the circuit judge, a stern, impartial man who was due to pass through the territory, requesting a formal hearing. The request was granted. Since the town's courthouse was Creedy's domain, the hearing was to be held in a neutral location, the large, empty grain warehouse at the edge of town. The law, it seemed, was coming to Drywater, whether Judge Creedy liked it or not. The day of the hearing dawned tense and gray. A cold wind blew dust down the main street. By mid-morning, the town was divided. On one side of the street, Rafe Cutter and a dozen hard-faced men he had hired from out of the territory loitered in front of the saloon, their hands never far from their pistols. They were a visible, swaggering threat, a promise of violence. On the other side, the members of the Citizens' Council and their families gathered, their faces grim but determined. Inside the warehouse, the air was cold and smelled of dust and old grain. Light streamed in through the high, grimy windows, illuminating a makeshift courtroom. The circuit judge sat at a rough plank table, his face impassive. Edward Tompkins stood beside Naomi and a cleaned-up Thomas Reed. Across from them sat Judge Creedy and the banker, Samuel Blackwood, their expressions a mask of arrogant disdain. The warehouse was packed with spectators, a silent, standing jury of the entire town. The hearing began. Tompkins was methodical, building his case piece by piece. He called Naomi to the stand. She walked with a quiet dignity, her voice clear and unwavering as she recounted her journey, the fraudulent contract, and the discovery of the fake seal. She presented the signed statements from Anya and Mary, her words painting a picture of a systematic, predatory scheme. Then Thomas Reed took the stand. He was frail, but his voice was filled with a righteous anger as he described his abduction and the horrors of the labor camp. He presented the ledger, the Book of Secrets, and Tompkins read the damning entries aloud. As the names and figures echoed in the cavernous space, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Finally, Tompkins called Samuel Blackwood to the stand. The banker walked with a forced confidence, but a fine sheen of sweat had appeared on his brow. Tompkins presented the ledger, pointing to Blackwood's signature. "Is this your signature, Mr. Blackwood?" he asked, his voice ringing with authority. "Did you authorize these payments, knowing they were the profits from a scheme to defraud homesteaders and enslave men?" Blackwood licked his dry lips. He looked at Creedy, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. "I do not recognize this document," Blackwood lied, his voice thin. "It is a fabrication." The crowd stirred. A low growl of disbelief. The faces of his neighbors, people who had banked with him for years, were turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. Anya, the young German widow, began to weep softly. The sound was more damning than any accusation. Tompkins pressed. "You asked this court to believe that these women, that Mr. Reed, that all these people are lying. You ask us to ignore the evidence of your own hand." The pressure in the room was immense, a physical weight. Blackwood's composure began to crumble. His eyes darted around the room, finding no sympathy, only judgment. He looked at Creedy again, but the judge's face was a mask of cold fury. Blackwood was alone. He was a man of figures and commerce, not violence. He was not prepared for this. He forced me to do it," Blackwood blurted out, the words tumbling from his mouth in a desperate rush. "Creedy. It was all his plan. He controlled the loans. He threatened to ruin me. I did what he said. I signed the papers. It was all him." A collective gasp went through the warehouse. The confession hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. Creedy lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage. But it was too late. The truth was out. At that exact moment, a gunshot cracked through the air from outside, shattering one of the high windows. It was a signal. Pandemonium erupted inside the warehouse. But outside, the real battle had begun. Rafe Cutter and his men had made their move, firing into the air to break up the hearing and create chaos. Cole, Lee Wei, and a handful of other men from the council had been waiting, positioned near a shallow irrigation ditch that ran along the edge of the town. They returned fire, and the street became a battlefield. Cole lay flat in the ditch, the scent of gunpowder and damp earth filling his nostrils. He fired the Winchester with a cold, steady precision, not aiming to kill, but to keep their heads down. Lee Wei was beside him, surprisingly calm, reloading a shotgun with methodical movements. Thomas Reed, though weak, handled a pistol with a grim determination. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned down. Cutter's men were advancing, using the buildings for cover, their bullets thudding into the bank of the ditch around them. Cole felt a searing pain in his left arm and looked down to see a line of red soaking through his sleeve. A stray bullet had grazed him. The fight was turning against them. They could not hold out for long. And then he heard it, a sound that did not belong in a gunfight. It was the rumble of wagon wheels and the thunder of hooves, coming not from the street, but from the open prairie. He looked up and saw a sight that made his heart leap. It was Eleanor Brandt, standing tall in the driver's seat of her big farm wagon, whipping her team of draft horses into a gallop. Behind her came two more wagons, filled with the women of the council. They were not screaming or panicking. They were sitting straight and tall, and in their hands they held shotguns and hunting rifles. They charged toward the flank of Cutter's men, a wild, improbable cavalry. The gunmen, caught completely by surprise, turned to face this new threat. Their momentary confusion was all Cole and his men needed. They rose from the ditch and laid down a covering fire. The women in the wagons fired a volley, their aim more enthusiastic than accurate, but the effect was devastating. Faced with a fight on two fronts, Cutter's men lost their nerve. They broke and ran, scattering like quail into the prairie, Rafe Cutter shouting curses as he fled with them. Silence fell over the street, broken only by the panting of men and the stamping of horses. Back in the warehouse, order was being restored. Edward Tompkins stood before the circuit judge, his voice ringing with triumph. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Blackwood's confession and the armed insurrection outside this court, I demand you issue a warrant for the immediate arrest of Judge Silas Creedy." The circuit judge looked at Creedy, his eyes like chips of ice. He looked at the acting sheriff, Deputy Miller, who was pale and trembling. Then he took a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed the warrant with a flourish. He handed it to Miller. "Serve it," he commanded. The fight was over. Naomi stood in the doorway of the warehouse, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She watched as Creedy was led away, his face a mask of disbelief. The town was free. She scanned the street, her heart pounding in her chest, searching for one face, and then she saw him. Cole was walking toward her, his shirt torn, his arm bleeding, his face smudged with gunpowder. But he was alive. He was walking toward her. All the strength that had held her up through the hearing, through the entire ordeal, suddenly left her. Her knees buckled and she sagged against the doorframe, a wave of dizziness washing over her. He was there in an instant, his good arm steadying her. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. The remaining members of the council gathered around them, their faces weary but victorious. Naomi reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. Cole looked at the people surrounding them, at Eleanor and Lee Wei and the pastor. He looked down at Naomi, at the woman who had knocked on his door in a snowstorm, and turned his entire world upside down. "I choose her," he said, his voice rough but clear, loud enough for all of them to hear, not because of any letter or any contract. "I choose her because of what we have survived together." He said the words simply, a plain statement of fact, but they were the most powerful vow he could make. Naomi took the silk scarf from around her neck and, with gentle, practiced hands, began to wrap it around his bleeding arm, tying a knot that was meant to hold. In the days that followed the gunfight, A strange and unfamiliar quiet settled over Drywater. It was not the tense silence of fear, but the deep, collective breath of a town waking from a long nightmare. Judge Silas Creedy was gone. Escorted by federal marshals to await trial in Laramie, the banker, Samuel Blackwood, facing ruin and a long prison sentence, had quickly agreed to a deal. He would testify against his former master in exchange for a lesser charge, and his bank would be responsible for making restitution to the families Creedy had defrauded. The rule of the Iron Fist was over. The first sign of the new era was the reinstatement of Sheriff Eben Hale. He rode back into town not with fanfare, but with a quiet dignity, his old badge pinned back on his chest. His first official act was to post a notice on the door of his office, a notice that declared all of Creedy's recent foreclosures null and void. A quiet cheer went up from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. The law, it seemed, had found its way back to Drywater. The healing of the community began not in the courthouse, but on the blackened patch of earth where Cole's hay barn had stood. Led by Eleanor Brandt, the town organized what they called a unity fair. It was less a fair and more a barn raising, a collective act of reconstruction. From every corner of the basin, people came, bringing what they could. Farmers who had once looked away from coal in the street now arrived with wagons loaded with fresh-cut lumber. The German family from the South Fork brought a crate of hand-forged nails. Lee Way closed his forge for the day and came with his tools and his expertise, directing the construction with a quiet, confident authority. The air, which had so recently smelled of ash and gunpowder, was now filled with the clean scent of sawdust and pine. The rhythmic sound of hammers and saws replaced the crack of rifles. The women set up long tables, laden with roasted chickens, fresh bread, and apple pies. Even families who had been too afraid to stand with them before now contributed, their offerings a quiet apology, a down payment on a new beginning. Cole worked alongside them, his initial awkwardness giving way to a profound, humbling gratitude. These were his neighbors, and, for the first time, he felt like he was truly one of them. He saw men who had been on opposite sides of a bitter divide now working together, lifting the same beam, sharing the same cup of water. In their shared labor, the wounds of the town began to close. Naomi moved through the gathering like a gentle but undeniable force. She was no longer the frightened stranger, the mail-order bride who had knocked on the wrong door. She was Naomi Carter, the woman who had faced down the judge, the teacher who had brought the truth to light. The other women sought her out, not with suspicion, but with a newfound respect. They asked her advice on mending and on reading contracts. They saw in her not a victim, but a leader. Her greatest contribution to the town's future began a week later. She cleaned out the small, disused storeroom at the back of the church and tacked up a notice of her own. It announced an evening school, open to any adult who wished to learn to read and write. The first night, she was not sure anyone would come, but as dusk settled, they began to arrive in a slow, hesitant trickle. There were 2 young cowboys, their faces scrubbed clean, who shuffled their feet and held their hats in their hands, embarrassed but determined. There was Anya, the German widow, who wanted to be able to read the letters from her family in the old country. A Polish farmer named Stanislaw came, his big hands clumsy with the chalk, but his eyes bright with concentration. Lee Way attended, wishing to perfect his written English, and sitting in the back, his large frame hunched over a slate, was Cole. He did not say a word, but his presence was a quiet, powerful endorsement. Naomi stood before them, a piece of chalk in her hand, and felt a sense of purpose she had not known since her little school in St. Louis was taken from her. This was more than a classroom. It was a place where the community was forging a new kind of strength, a strength built not on intimidation, but on understanding. She was not just giving lessons in literacy. She was giving her students a voice, a tool to protect themselves, a key to a wider world. Justice, in its slow, deliberate way, continued to mend the broken pieces of their lives. With the help of Edward Tompkins, a portion of the restitution funds from the bank was used to establish a small claim for Thomas Reed on a fertile patch of land upstream from Cole's property. It was a place with good water and rich soil, a place where a man could truly start over. Reed, his health slowly returning, accepted with a quiet, tearful gratitude. He had lost a bride he never knew, but he had regained his freedom and the chance for a future. One afternoon, Cole stood in his newly rebuilt barn, the scent of fresh-cut wood a balm to his soul. In his hands, he held a long, smooth plank of pine. For the past week, he had been practicing, filling slates with the letters, his hand growing steadier, more confident. He took a brush and a pot of black paint, and with slow, deliberate strokes, he began to paint. It took him the better part of the day. When he was finished, he stepped back, a deep satisfaction settling in his chest. The sign was simple, the letters not perfectly straight, but they were clear and strong. Whitaker and Carter, it read, and underneath, in smaller letters, cattle and honest water. He had not just painted a sign, he had written a new chapter of his life. He was no longer just Whitaker, the solitary rancher. He was Whitaker and Carter, a partnership, a unit. He had named his business after the two things that now defined his world, the livestock that was his livelihood, and the integrity for which they had both fought and bled. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the basin, he took Naomi by the hand and led her from the cabin. The air was cool and clean, the sky a tapestry of deepening purple and orange. He said nothing, but walked her to the porch of their small home. In his other hand, he carried an object she recognized immediately. It was the old storm lantern, the one that had been sitting on the windowsill that first night, its glass smudged with soot, its metal dented. He had cleaned it, the glass now shone, and the brass had been polished to a warm gleam. He reached up and hung it from the iron hook that had been empty for as long as he had lived there. It was the place where a family was supposed to hang its beacon, its welcome light. He turned to face her, the soft twilight casting his rugged features in a gentle relief. He looked down at their joined hands, then met her eyes. His own were filled with an emotion so deep and sincere it made her heart ache. "When you came here," he began, his voice low and a little rough, "you came with a contract, a piece of paper that said you belonged to another man." It was all a lie. He took her other hand, holding both of hers in his large, warm grip. "That paper is gone, but the home is real. What we built here, in this place, is real." He slowly went down on one knee on the rough wooden planks of the porch. His movements were not elegant, but they were filled with a profound reverence. "I am not a man of fancy words. Naomi, all I have is what you see, this land, these hands, and a heart that you have taught to feel again." He looked up at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I am asking you to make this a home for good, not with a contract someone else wrote, but with a promise we make to each other. Naomi Carter, will you choose me? Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of his strong, earnest face. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a joy so complete it felt like a physical release. She thought of the long, lonely road that had brought her here, the betrayals and the hardships, the snowstorm and the fire, the fear and the hope. It had all led to this man, kneeling before her, offering her not a business arrangement, but a partnership of the soul. "Yes," she whispered, the word a soft breath of wonder. "Oh, Cole, yes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly. Burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, he held her tight, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, she was above them. The newly hung lantern caught the last rays of the setting sun, its polished surface glowing like a captured star, a silent witness to a promise made, a home truly found. They were married on a day when the Wyoming sky was a high, boundless blue. so vast and clear it felt like a benediction. There was no church, no gilded hall. Their cathedral was the open meadow behind the cabin, the same meadow that had been scarred by fire and healed by a community's kindness. The residents of the Cheyenne Basin, the people who had fought alongside them, formed a wide, imperfect circle, their presence a living testament to the town's rebirth. Eleanor Brant stood tall and proud, her weathered face softened by a rare, gentle smile. Li Wei was there, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his chest, a look of quiet satisfaction in his dark eyes. Anya, the German widow, held a small bouquet of wildflowers, her tears this time being ones of joy. Stanislaw the farmer, Thomas Reed, Sheriff Hale, and even the nervous store proprietor stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences washed away by the shared struggle they had endured. They were a patchwork of humanity, a collection of solitary souls who had discovered they were stronger together. The pastor's words were as simple and unadorned as the landscape itself. He spoke not of angels and heavens, but of resilience, of planting roots in hard ground, and of the courage it takes to build a home. Naomi did not wear a traditional white gown. Instead, she wore a simple cotton dress and a beautiful shawl Eleanor had given her, its edges painstakingly embroidered with the pale, resilient flowers of the wild sagebrush. It was a symbol of the tough, fragrant beauty of this land she had come to call home. Cole stood beside her, his usual rough work clothes replaced by a clean shirt and trousers. Tucked into the band of his hat was a single sprig of sage, its silvery green leaves a mirror to the embroidery on her shawl. He was a man of the earth, and she was the unexpected blossom that had taken root beside him. Just before the pastor asked for their vows, Naomi turned her head. She looked past the circle of friends, her gaze settling on the small log cabin that stood on the rise. It looked solid, permanent, its new barn gleaming in the sunlight beside it. She saw the porch, the window she had looked through in fear, the door that had been her salvation. It was the place where she, a mail-order bride, had knocked on the wrong door. She turned back to Cole, her eyes shining. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "That night I knocked on the wrong door," she said, "but your heart opened the right one." A slow smile touched his lips, a smile of such profound tenderness that it transformed his rugged face. He squeezed her hand, a silent answer that needed no words. As they spoke their vows, a quiet promise to choose each other, day after day, a breeze rustled the prairie grass, and in the distance, a herd of young horses foaled that spring galloped across the plains, their movements a fluid expression of freedom and life. The waters of Willow Creek, the source of so much conflict, sparkled in the sunlight, a ribbon of life flowing honestly and freely, no longer a tool of greed but a gift to all. The news had arrived from Laramie the day before, delivered by a rider on his way to the territories. Sheriff Hale had shared it with them privately, a final, satisfying chord in their long symphony of struggle. Judge Silas Creedy had been found guilty on all counts of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. His name, once a source of terror, was now just a cautionary tale whispered in the capital. Rafe Cutter, captured by a posse a week after the gunfight, had also been sentenced. His reign of violence ending not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet, ignominious clang of a prison door. Justice had been done. Slow and hard-won, but complete. The celebration that followed the wedding was not a lavish affair, but it was rich in spirit. They shared food and stories, the sound of laughter echoing across the meadow. Cole, who had spent a lifetime holding himself apart, moved through the crowd with a new, easy grace. Naomi always at his side, he was no longer an island. He was part of a mainland. Connected by shared experience and mutual respect, he had risked everything for a principle, and in doing so, had gained a community. As evening fell and the neighbors began their long rides home, a different kind of life settled back over the Whitaker and Carter ranch. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm of peaceful, productive work. They rode the fences together, mended the tack, and tallied the figures in the ledger that Cole could now read for himself. One evening, Naomi rode back from town alone. She had held her first class in the church storeroom since the wedding. As she approached the cabin, she heard the low murmur of voices from inside. She smiled. It was the sound of her evening school. She dismounted and peered through the window. The room was bathed in the warm glow of several lanterns. Her students were all there, their faces etched with concentration as they hunched over their slates. She saw the two young cowboys, their brows furrowed as they slowly sounded out a passage from a book. She saw Li Wei, his brushstrokes in his notebook now as confident with English letters as they were with Chinese characters. She saw Anya and Stanislaw helping each other, their shared struggle with a new language forging a bond between them. And on the small blackboard that served as the room's centerpiece, a sentence was still visible, written in Cole's determined, slightly shaky hand. It was the sentence she had first taught him, the one that had become the unofficial motto of their new life. Home is where we choose each other. She watched for a moment longer, her heart swelling with a quiet, powerful pride. This was her legacy, not a grand monument, but a small room filled with light and learning, a place where people were being given the tools to build better, more secure lives for themselves. She had come to the West seeking a safe harbor and had instead helped build a lighthouse. She stepped away from the window and walked onto the porch. The night was cool, the stars so bright they looked like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. She sat on the top step, breathing in the clean, sage-scented air. A few minutes later, the cabin door opened and Cole came out. He sat down beside her, his familiar, solid presence a comforting warmth in the cool night. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. They sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the gentle sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant, lonesome call of a coyote. Their life was here, in this quiet, immense land that had tested them and nearly broken them. But in its harshness, they had found not only each other, but the truest versions of themselves. He was no longer the man who believed relying on anyone was a weakness, and she was no longer the woman who felt her fate was in the hands of others. He leaned over and lit the storm lantern that hung from the hook on the porch, the one he had so carefully cleaned and polished. Its flame sputtered to life, casting a warm, steady glow that pushed back the immense darkness of the prairie. It was not a brilliant light, but it was enough. It was a beacon. It shone on the new sign he had so proudly painted, on the sturdy logs of the cabin, and on their two faces, turned toward each other. In its gentle, golden light, she could see the quiet strength in his eyes, the deep lines of a life lived hard, and the enduring love that had taken root there. It was a simple, steadfast light for a simple, steadfast love. A promise of warmth against any storm the future might hold. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and press the hype button to help it reach more people.